Okay, so welcome to our first panel of a packed day. We have two panels following each other immediately. Our panel 3 is on Western and Northern Europe, and I just want to say that we'll be talking, the focus of this first panel are the volumes 5 and 12 of the edition, covering the 6 Nazi-occupied countries of Western and Northern Europe in the period 1940 to 45. And I'm very pleased and proud to say that these 2 volumes are already available in English, speaking from my position with the PMJ project team. I'll just mention these 2 volumes were produced by quite a large team of Bearbeiter and Bearbeiterinnen. The executive editors of volume 5, covering the period up to 1942, were Katja Happe, Michael Meyer, and Maya Peers, with the assistance of Jean-Marc Dreyfus. And the executive editors of volume 12, covering summer 1942 onwards, were Katja Happe, Barbara Lambauer, and Clemens Meyer-Wolthausen, with the assistance of Maya Peers. So I'm delighted to introduce our 2 speakers, Barbara Lambauer and Bob Moore. Barbara Lambauer is our, so to speak, representative of the executive editors for these 2 volumes. She studied in Graz and at Sciences Po in Paris, where she completed her doctorate on Otto Abetz, which was published in 2001. Since then, she's published widely on German anti-Semitic policies in France and on Franco-German collaboration. And more recently, she's been publishing on Jewish minorities in Central and Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Bob Moore is our external commentator. I'll just let the screen come down. Okay, so Bob Moore is Professor Emeritus of 20th Century European History at the University of Sheffield in the UK. Following his study of the Nazi persecution of the Jews in the Netherlands, Victims and Survivors, the Nazi persecution of the Jews in the Netherlands, 1940 to 45, which appeared in 1997, he's published very widely on the Second World War and the Holocaust. He's particularly focused on resistance movements, on refugee policies, on the rescue of Jews in wartime Europe, and on the repatriation and rehabilitation of prisoners of war after the Second World War. So, both speakers in this panel will present in English, but just want to make it clear the speakers would welcome questions and discussion afterwards, both in English and German. So please don't feel compelled to pose your questions in English. So I'd like to hand over to Barbara Lambauer.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the organizers for inviting me to present our volumes. So I've prepared some slides to accompany my presentation. Yes, we are already in the middle. Let's go back. Okay, and I'm greeting especially Katja Happe, who is in the room, who has worked on the Netherlands in the 2 volumes, and Clemens, I'm not sure that he's here tomorrow or today, he was here yesterday. Okay, so I'm talking, my paper focuses mainly on France, with some concluding side glances on the region as a whole. The region who was the region of the, actually, Northern and Western Europe democratic states that were occupied by the Wehrmacht in 1940. France is maybe a special case, a land of the revolution of 1789, The largest of the 6 countries was the first European power to grant Jews equal rights in 1791. However, unlike Britain, and especially unlike Norway, the French government stopped fighting Germany 3 days after the Wehrmacht had taken Paris and remained in the country. Henceforth, France became a sort of laboratory for collaboration policies, but also a showcase, vitrine for the world outside the Nazi Empire. If I had to sum up the French case for only 2 key points, because I have not so much time, the first would deal with fairly unforeseen Franco-German convergences. To understand the important, and I had also prepared a slide with, so you can see the northern and western Europe, so that's the countries we have worked on in the 2 volumes. To understand the important political shift that took place in France in 1940, it is necessary to look back at the interwar years. In the 1920s, France, like also Belgium, had become an important immigrant country. Also, not only, but also for Jewish populations from Eastern Europe. And it became one of the first places for refugees from Germany after 1933. So, in this way, until 1939, the Jewish population in France increased from 200,000 to 300,000 persons. Half of these newcomers obtained French citizenship. But in the last decade before war, the country went through a deep economic and political crisis which gave rise to right-wing extremist, xenophobic and anti-Semitic movements. Movements that would gain significant influence after the French collapse in June 1940. But still under the Republic, at the outbreak of the war, the government decreed the internment of citizens of so-called enemy states, meaning first and foremost refugees from Germany. A part of these camps had been set up a few months earlier for fugitives from Spain. Others were improvised on empty sites. Precedents existed in Belgium and in the Netherlands, 2 other countries that had taken in large numbers of refugees in previous years. And the purpose was to optimize relief work for destitute refugees, but very quickly also to exercise control, or to pretend to do so, over these foreigners by authorities. How little the knowledge about the desperate situation of these internees in France seemed to reach the world outside the barbed wire is documented in volume 5, for example, through a letter addressed to the editor of the New York Times in November 1939, and also a year later through the report of Rabbi Kappel after his visit in Gurs. After its defeat and the signature of the Franco-German Armistice Agreement in June 1940, France was divided into several zones. Each one was subject to different authorities and regulations. Most of the Jews stayed in the 2 largest zones, the northern zone, which was under German military administration, and the southern zone, which was administered sovereignly by the Vichy government. The existence of this so-called free zone was a rather peculiar element in Western Europe, as was the existence of the Vichy government. It was formed by the 84-year-old Marshal Pétain, who had previously received full powers from the last National Assembly of the Third Republic at the beginning of July. In short, Vichy owed its very existence to the presence of the Wehrmacht on French soil. That is a very important point, and this remained so until the German withdrawal. Persecution of Jewish populations was not among the first measures taken by the German occupant after the invasion of Western European countries. This was without doubt due to concerns about possible reactions in the population. However, Volume 5 documents how in France anti-Semitic measures soon turned out to be possible. That is what the envoy of the German Foreign Ministry in Paris, Otto Abetz, pointed to soon after his nomination as ambassador in August 1940. A few weeks later, preparations were made in order to enforce first regulations on the German side, with repercussions also in the other countries and other occupied countries. Professional bans, expropriations, registration, etc. from autumn 1940 to summer 1941. In parallel, in July 1940 already, from the very first days of its existence, the new government under Marshal Pétain in Vichy launched its own anti-Semitic policy. Its aim was, on the one hand, to diminish Jewish influence in France, especially in economic and cultural life, and on the other hand, to take action against Jewish immigrants and refugees in order to make them leave the country. In this respect, the new regime clearly tied in with pre-war xenophobic tendencies. Until 1942, the double persecution policy developed gradually and followed particular dynamics. Measures taken by the German occupying power in Paris or by the French government in Vichy complemented and reinforced each other. Several documents highlight this close Franco-German connection and interaction, sometimes incorrectly described as parallel, while in reality it was literally interlocked. Yet, the close relationship between the two was less a result of the same ideological orientation or Pétain's presumed wish to collaborate with Hitler Germany. Instead, it was the French government's being jealously on its guard concerning the exercise of its sovereign rights, also in the occupied zones, occupied territories. In this way, the coexistence of German and French authorities in large parts of the country gave German authorities a precious means of pressure on French politics by approving or rejecting the implementation of French laws in occupied territories. From the very beginning, German authorities realized this possible leverage for steering French policy. Measures against Jews should thus be, as far as possible, be carried out by French authorities. By leaving its implementation to the French, the Germans not only saved their own manpower, but also let the French authorities sign up for responsible. Moreover, the Franco-German armistice agreement required the French cooperation in order to guarantee the security of the occupying forces. Jews, regardless of their nationality, were systematically considered as a threat to this security. Designated more than considered, actually. When in spring 1941, French authorities had to open new camps for communists to be arrested. The first large group were Jewish, stateless immigrants in May 1941 in Paris, 3,700 former citizens from Poland, Austria and Czechoslovakia, and imprisoned in the new camps of Pithiviers and Beaune-la-Rolande, from where they were deported to Auschwitz the following year. The same considerations also underlie the second roundup from August 1941 and the resolution of the so-called hostage crisis of autumn 1941. From the end of 1941 onwards, the Germans decided to systematically direct against Jews and communists the reprisals decided after attacks from the French resistance movement, thus radicalizing persecution of Jews in France. The first train leaving France for Auschwitz in March 1942 had 743 men on board, almost exclusively French Jewish citizens who had been arrested in December after attacks from the resistance. Disguising arrests and internment of Jews behind operations against the so-called Jewish Bolshevik underground calmed possible public uneasiness or protests. Similar strategies may be observed a few times later in Norway, and of course, earlier on the Eastern Front. Another aspect that I would like to give emphasis to, my second key point, concerns questions of nationality. Second and last key point. As a matter of fact, German occupiers took account of the fact that cooperation of Vichy authorities, and above all its police, in all parts of France, were indeed sheerly unlimited as long as communists or foreign Jews were concerned. Hence, France was mentioned at the VEJ-Konferenz as the country where the evacuation of the Jews could be carried out without major obstacles. From the 3 years of mass deportations from France, the first, 1942, was particularly disastrous. Nearly 42 persons were deported. of whom 36,000 after special agreement concluded between the French and the German police. This is more than were deported from the Netherlands at the same time, where rates set by Berlin could not be met this year. Yet, in the 2 following years, the number of deportees from France diminished considerably, to much less than the half of the 1942 rate, 70,000 in 1943 and 15,000 in 1944. How did it come? There are several reasons. But a large number of the deputies from 1942 came from the internment camps in southern France that the government was eager to close, these camps that had been created in 1939, I mentioned before. Outside the camps, the French police played a crucial role for the arrest of stateless and foreign Jews. Several documents in volume 12 describe the meticulous preparation by the authorities of arrest operations, as well as of this transfer by train from one zone to another of thousands of people from these camps, and the frightful atmosphere of these weeks and months with countless individual persons and families trying to escape. As an example, I would like to mention Karl-Heinz Reinsberg's document 254 here on the picture with his wife, who expresses his profound disappointment concerning France. And I quote in German, the English translation is on the slide: Was sich hier abgespielt hat, ist in der Weltgeschichte noch nie dagewesen. Es ist grausam, welche herzzerreißenden Szenen sich schon abgespielt haben. Die größte Enttäuschung meines Lebens ist das. Ich, der immer so große Stücke auf die Franzosen gehalten hatte, auf ihr Ehrgefühl, ihre Begriffe von Freiheit und so weiter. Das alles so in den Schmutz gezogen. Man sollte meinen, es wäre nur ein Traum, aber leider ist alles bittere Wahrheit. Similar impressions can be found in the long report written by Pastor Henri Manen from the Camp Les Milles. I've also joined a map of the, here you see all the camps actually of the southern zone as well as on the northern zone, of the Camp Les Milles, or in the description of the situation of children brought to Drancy before being deported to Auschwitz. Despite Vichy's own anti-Semitic agenda, in no other country the question of nationality seemed as crucial for German politics as it was in France. Yet, scenes of brutal arrests of Jewish families in the streets of big cities like Paris, Lyon or Toulouse shocked public opinion and gave way to openly voiced protests, especially from the churches. Jews, especially non-French Jews, reacted in hiding and going underground. The number of arrests during roundups remained thus increasingly beneath the target. From September 1942 on, sporadically, and from 1943 onwards, more and more systematically, the German police added imprisoned French Jewish citizens in order to fill the deportation trains. French authorities at first responded through intensifying the manhunt against foreign Jews by its policemen. But these were less and less eager to do the work for the Germans. In spring 1943, French collaboration in tracking Jews was largely shrinking, for still continuing in certain places such as Paris, where personnel connections between the French and the German police hierarchy remained strong. Still, this is how the number of deputies fell during the following months. Roundups in different parts of France were henceforth carried out by the German police. Above all, not only. This question of nationality became even subject of political debates in nowadays France, as, for example, last year when the journalist and candidate for presidency, Éric Zemmour, went so far to falsely claim that Vichy France had protected French Jews. Another recent and heated debate, this time among historians, is linked somehow to the Zemmour case, was on the reasons how, despite Vichy's anti-Semitism, the victim rate in France remained relatively low in comparison to Belgium and to the Netherlands. Different models of explanation exist, but none refers, of course, to a Vichy policy that could have been protective, of course. To conclude this presentation, we can see that the France case, or French okay, thank you, holds material for discussion when we raise the question of the European dimension of the Holocaust and the importance of collaboration by non-Germans. This applies not only to France, of course, but to the whole region of Northern and Western Europe. So maybe my colleague Katja Harper would like to join some comment afterwards in the discussion on other or similar cases. Instead of a conclusion, I would like very briefly to explore this question further in comparing the 6 countries, former Western democracies. I have made a table in comparing the different victim rates in proportion to the population, the number of persons being called Jews in the different countries, and I've also transferred it into a graphic, maybe more telling. Ja, Moment, das geht jetzt also so. And also the number of documents actually in the volume 12 linked to these numbers. So to comparing how and when different steps of persecution were taken in the 6 countries reveals the common framing and the close relationship. And maybe this morning we were discussing with Frank Bayor on a communication field between different countries and occupation regimes, bringing about the transfer of strategies and initiatives. I hope that the collection of documents covering these 6 countries in the 2 volumes contributes to give a glimpse on these connections and simultaneities and open new research perspectives. Thank you. Macht nichts, huh?
Many thanks, Barbara. I'll now hand over straight away to Bob Moore.
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, my first task is to congratulate the editors on their selection of documents and their inclusion of sources from the perpetrators, the victims and the bystanders in each of the 6 countries represented here. The coverage undoubtedly reflects, informs and enhances our understanding of the circumstances and debates surrounding the persecution and deportation of the Jews from Western Europe. Barbara Lambauer has already spoken in detail about the French case, so I'll restrict my comments to the other countries represented in these volumes. That said, the vast documentation provided by the editors means I'll have to be content with just a few brief comments on a very small number of the documents and their relationship to the many debates on the persecution, deportation and ultimate fate of the Jews in Western Europe. Let me start with Scandinavia. The Danish case is undoubtedly the most unusual of the 6 and is often, erroneously in my view, held up as an example of what might have been possible elsewhere. What the selected documents clearly show are the unique set of circumstances that pertained in Denmark before the autumn of 1943, and at least 2 salient factors that had a critical bearing on the ability of most Danish Jews to escape deportation. The first is the changing attitude of the Swedish Foreign Ministry in the late summer of 1943, and we can suggest all sorts of reasons why that might have happened. Firstly, by offering sanctuary to any Danish Jews born in Sweden, which must have been a fairly small group of people, and then extending this to all Danish Jews who could find their way to Swedish territory at the beginning of October 1943. The supporting document here is not the notification from the Swedish Foreign Ministry, but the newspaper report in the New York Times, something that not only contextualizes the action that took place, but also shows how the information reached the wider world. The second element here is the actions of Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz in informing the leader of the Danish Social Democratic Party about the planned Juden Aktion, planned for the 2nd of October, and the opportunity this gave to warn the Jewish community and for the Danish resistance organisations in Copenhagen and elsewhere to mobilise help. His role in this process is clear, but more problematic remains whether Reich Plenipotentiary Werner Best knew of and approved of his actions. Other factors are also worthy of highlighting here. For example, the fortuitous absence of German naval patrols in the waters between Denmark and Sweden in this critical period, and also the limited pursuit of Jews in hiding, save possibly for the actions of one individual, Hauptscharführer Hans Juhl, who was responsible for by far the largest single arrest of fugitives, the 85 Jews found in hiding in the church in the village of Gilleleje while waiting for transport across the Sound to Sweden. These so-called favourable factors, a term that was coined many years ago by the Dutch historian A.J. van der Leeuw in noting their absence in the Dutch case, undoubtedly contributed greatly to the rescue and survival of almost 95% of the Jews in Denmark. In contrast, the fate of the small, perhaps 2,000-strong Norwegian Jewish community was heavily influenced by the timing of German actions in November 1942 and the very different attitudes of the Swedish government to Jewish refugees crossing its borders at that time. Border crossing and the terrain was in any case difficult, but there had been cases of refoulement, of fugitives being handed back by the Swedish authorities, something that only began to change very much later in 1942. Nevertheless, in looking at the Danish and indeed in the Norwegian cases, we can perceive some similarities with other national case studies of protests from the clergy and of rescue activities. In this case, the testimony of the redoubtable Myrtle Wright, a Quaker and peace activist, who had left us with a detailed diary of her activities between 1940 and 1944, when she herself escaped to Sweden with several hidden Jewish children. Let me move on to a topic which I hope I'm a little bit more confident about. The juxtaposition of the Dutch and Belgian cases in these volumes allows for a more detailed comparative approach, which had traditionally been employed to explain the different levels of mortality, highlighted by Barbara, between these two countries, as well as in relation to France. This type of analysis was pioneered in the 1970s, but taken stages further by Griffion and Zeller, for example, who sought to add value to all the elements involved in order to isolate those that had the greatest impact. Many of the salient factors are represented in the documentation presented here, which allow the reader to assess the convergences and incongruities between the countries. And I'm just going to list a few other examples from the ones that Barbara has given, or some are in parallel. For example, the context in Belgium, a country which had recent experience of German occupation and contrasted very much with the neutrality of the Netherlands in the Great War. The imposition of military government in Belgium and civil government in the Netherlands. The importance of the SS and its various agencies in the Netherlands when compared with their relative weakness in Belgium. The larger presence of German police and the greater degree of coordination of domestic police agencies in the Netherlands when compared with what took place in Belgium. The preponderance of foreign Jews in the Belgian Jewish communities, something like 90%, compared with the 80% of Dutch Jews who were Dutch nationals and Dutch citizens. The role of civil servants in aiding and or frustrating the identification, pauperisation and deportation of Jews from their various countries. These factors are all represented in the documentation in the two volumes, and the commentary provides the reader with a clear guide to their importance. But other elements, such as the circumstances in which these events took place, are more difficult to encompass in documentary form. And there's also a question of the remit for the documents themselves, limited by chronology, which makes that the commentary even more important in being able to allude to and bring in other sources which, by definition, were excluded from the collections themselves. By doing so, these fill gaps and provide background and context to the individual sources presented. Let me move on to two separate categories which I see as represented in these document collections. First of all, to talk about organisational structures. The steps towards deportation process are carefully chronicled, in many cases coming directly from the functionaries directly responsible. Seyss-Inquart, Zöpf, Oosterfunten, even Fräulein Schlotke in the Netherlands, and Ernst Ehlers in Belgium. On other occasions, the editors have again chosen to use sources that serve a dual function. For example, the summary of measures against the Jews provided by the Dutch Secret Service to the government in exile in February, that not only outlines the process, but also shows what the Queen and her ministers were told in London in that period. Likewise, we're presented with several documents that outline the positions of the Jewish organisations, specifically the Joodse Raad in Amsterdam and its Belgian counterpart. For the Netherlands, there is a telling set of Joodse Raad minutes for the 25th of April 1943 that notes the disturbing increases in actions against the Jews, both day and night, and the unsuccessful protests of the joint chairman, Abraham Ascher and David Cohen, to the authorities. Essentially, their attempts to represent and to mediate the interests of the Jewish community in the Netherlands had come to nothing in the face of the imperatives of the deportation process. Some comparisons can be made here with the resignation of Rabbi Ullmann as head of the Belgian Association de Juifs de Belgique, and the later diary entries of Salomon van den Berg concerning his interactions with Fritz Erdmann, the leader of the Department 4B, between December 1942 and October 1943. These all help to inform the nature of those processes and the negotiations, such as they were, that took place. In the Belgian case, we're also presented with evidence of the widespread cooperation between clandestine organisations, primarily the Jewish Comité de Défense des Juifs, and the wider resistance represented by the Independence Front. Thus, in October 1942, the Independence Front's illegal newspaper in Hainaut published an extensive article that gave practical advice to its readers on helping fugitive Jews. Likewise, the documentation left by the CDJ itself gives a clear picture of this cooperation and how its clandestine operations related to children had developed since the beginning of the occupation. This was an organisation that ultimately helped to shelter something like 12,000 adult Jews and 4,000 children. It's a major undertaking. And I've raised the point here that nothing of that type could emerge in the Netherlands in quite the same way. I'll come back to that right at the end. Individual elements are one thing, but it's the individual testimonies that are perhaps have the greatest impact on us, the reader. We have contributions from well-known contemporary diarists amongst the victims, such as David Koker on everyday life in the concentration camp Vught, Philip Mechanicus on the conflict between German and Dutch Jews in Westerbork, and Etty Hillison, where she reflects on her own likely deportation and death. Equally compelling is the heart-rending letter written to a friend by Claartje van Aals, a nurse at the Apeldoornse Bos Sanatorium, a Jewish sanatorium, on the eve of the deportation of both patients and medical staff. Where we are going, we don't know yet, and what will happen to these people, we also don't know. It's a complete shambles. For Belgium, we have two extracts from the diary of Moshe Flinker, who had fled from the Netherlands to Belgium in 1942, but was arrested there in 1944 and deported to Auschwitz. These and other testimonies highlight the human element in the catastrophe that all too often reduces individuals to mere ciphers. Yet this individuality is not confined to the victims, as other perpetrators are also given voices. For example, particularly compelling one, the Marechaussee commander in northeastern province of Groningen, De Boer, who had obviously completely bought into National Socialist ideology, can be found complaining about his policemen refusing to be involved in the rounding up of Jews for deportation. His commitment to the cause is total. And he says, sorry, this is a translation from the German into English rather than the English version, it is the duty, Pflicht, of every policeman in the interest of his own culture to participate in the fight against this danger. Unfortunately, such refusals were a relative rarity in the Netherlands, and the crucial role of Cyber and Tulp's Amsterdam police in facilitating arrests has been well chronicled elsewhere. Such widespread cooperation was largely resisted in Brussels by a less compliant civil service and police force, but even there were nonetheless instances where the Belgian police were used in razzias, such as in Antwerp in August 1942. These comments highlight only a minuscule amount of the commentary and evidence presented in these two volumes to explain the fate of the Jews in these occupied countries. Not only have the sources been carefully contextualised, but they've also been meticulously referenced, providing the reader with a wealth of additional information about the authors, the documents, and also about the people and events mentioned in them. But to conclude very rapidly, in coming back to that comparative element, I'm always pushed back to the structural factors especially between Belgium and the Netherlands, to explain the differences in mortality between the two countries, of the differences in German rule and the compliance or otherwise of bureaucracies, both in terms of literal bureaucracies of civil servants, but also of the police, respective police forces, and the unchallenged cooperation, or unchallenged cooperation of the Overheid in Amsterdam, when compared with the much more compromised position of its Belgian counterpart. But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Bob. So I think two great papers, and they've given us much to discuss, I think, and a great basis for comparing the persecution of the Jews and the experience of Jewish victims in the 6 countries covered in these 2 volumes. I'd like just to before I throw it open to your questions, I'd like to perhaps raise a couple of points with both speakers that you might like to respond to anyway. My first question, if you like, is the way in which, well, you both emphasize the importance of the different structures of occupation, both in implementing persecution ordered by the German occupiers, but also in the case of France, actually devising and formulating policies in the first place. And you both emphasize the importance of native police forces in implementing persecution. The question of whether Dutch, Belgian, Norwegian, French police would cooperate or refuse to comply with orders to round up Jews for deportation. So we heard from Bob about the less compliant police in Brussels. Barbara Lambauer highlighted the continuing smooth cooperation of the Paris police in deportations at a time in spring 1943 where you're saying that the compliance was diminishing in other parts of France. So this is a mixed picture of compliance and occasional refusal on the part of native police forces, which I think is perhaps worth commenting on a little bit more. So maybe my question would be, did this compliance depend above all on structural factors, which is, I suppose, where Bob was going at the end, the structures within which these native police forces were operating? Or was their behaviour also coloured by other factors, cultural factors? Were they reflecting the popular attitudes that they could see and feel around them at a particular time in a particular occupation context when they either complied or refused to comply? So I'd just be curious in just pushing a little bit more on that point about the police. My other question, and I'll shut up and let you respond in a minute, is the question about the different composition of the Jewish population in the different countries. The presence of foreign refugees was a common element in all these countries, but the proportion of foreign Jews was different in different countries. And I suppose my curiosity is, was this a relevant factor in explaining survival rates, or is it actually are survival rates nothing to do with the proportion of foreign Jews in any particular country? It seems to be perhaps a paradox that the countries with the higher proportion of foreign Jews had a greater survival rate than those with a small proportion of foreign Jews in the case of the Netherlands. So to my mind, on the face of it, that's a paradox, but perhaps it's actually a route to an explanation that you can help me understand.
Okay, thank you very much for these very interesting questions. Of course, as always in life, isn't it? Things are connected, and I would say even the two questions are quite closely connected. So concerning the French policemen, there is a very important work that has been written a long time ago, 30 years ago by Bernd Carsten, Gute Franzosen, Good Frenchmen, and he highlighted already that maybe there are three factors or three elements that we could refer to that is first the ideological question. So French policemen were not so solidary, there was not so much solidarity with immigrants and with the communist movement among French policemen, so that made it easier, and they were actually specialized in the persecution, if I may say, of the communist movement since September 1939. At the outbreak of the war, the Communist Party in France was forbidden, and the communists went into the underground, so they really had a practice of underground, of clandestinité, as say in French language. And I think this is a very important point. The second would be the hierarchy. I actually refer to the agreement between the police, the chiefs, Auberg and Bousquet in France, the commitment that the French police will do nearly everything the German asks, as long as it doesn't concern French citizens, and as long as the German police respects the hierarchy of the French police, does not go directly to units of policemen to say, so now you are arresting this or another person. And that is a very important factor, because it worked, this agreement worked really during 12 months at least, until summer 1943. And the third factor is something that we can't really look after in the archives. However, there are the reports of the regional administrations. That is public opinion you refer to. And that is quite an important point, because in France, public opinion, but I think we have similar developments in other countries, really changed, and it was perceptible, and the French government also had to take account of it, and the police too. And that's actually why, and policemen actually were close to the general population. And yeah, there's another factor I have nearly forgotten. Of course, France, the southern zone, better to call it southern zone than free zone, was occupied in November 1942. And from this point on, there were large parts of former collaborators who actually took distance to the German occupation and to German collaboration. And the police during 1943 joined more and more the conservative resistance movement. So you have a very strong communist movement from 1941 onwards. And during 1942, you have more and more the conservative or Gaullist. There were very different political, actually, how do you say, different streamings. And the policemen joined more and more massively the resistance movement, and that's why I showed actually the numbers for 1944, and I was not really feeling good in it's 50,000 persons. I showed you the slide with the statistic of the 3 years, and actually 1944, that is only half a year. We have to double the number if you want to really compare it. So there is again something higher rates, higher arrests rates in France, and this is due to the fact that it's not anymore the police, the French police, but it's the milice, this new very, very extremist movement that was formed in 1942, and that was very close to German actors that came into the field very massively. So, and the second question actually is shorter. My answer will be shorter. Of course, the presence of a large part of foreign Jews in the population accelerated, I would say, anti-Semitic measures, maybe in each country, but in France it's very clear. But this is a population that came from eastern parts of Europe, and the German citizens, former German citizens, were a minority among the foreign Jews in France. Most part were immigrants from the 1920s and 1930s too. A lot of Polish Jews were among them. It's the largest group of deputies from France. And these persons actually were not very much integrated in French society. They came from countries where they were not really used to be confident on state power and state authorities. And that's why, and many of them were close to communist movements who offered an integration model for them. In France, communist movement who was in the underground since September 1939. So indeed, they had better instruments, or they were better prepared to persecution than were others. Thank you.
Very briefly then, in relation to the policing aspect, I think it's important to note how easy it was for the incoming Germans in the Netherlands in 1940 to completely reorganize Dutch policing and put their own people into positions of power at an early stage. I'm not talking about the imposition of German police, Gurnepolizei, but of the indigenous Dutch police structures were completely reorganized by the Germans relatively rapidly. In comparison with Belgium, where the deployment of Belgian police was a matter of negotiation between the Belgian bureaucracy and the German military government in the territory. And there, they almost used that as a stick. My recollection of it, there are other people in the audience who probably know more about this than I do, but my recollection is that the Belgian bureaucracy were prepared to say to the military government, we are not prepared to allow the Belgian police to be used for certain types of activity. If you insist on this, we will withdraw cooperation from a whole range of other things. Now, the military government, more interested in keeping the place stable and under control, weren't prepared to compromise that. The SS wasn't strong enough to push it far enough. And as a result, there are exceptions, but the Belgian police, generally speaking, weren't employed in the same ways that certainly the Amsterdam police were in rounding up Jews on a regular basis. In terms of policemen, there are one or two examples, very few examples, of Dutch policemen refusing to be involved in this process. But I was struck by a testament, which couldn't appear in this document collection because it's post-war, about the banality of it all, where a couple of policemen from Utrecht who after the war were asked, why did you take Jews from custody in Utrecht to Westerbork? And they said, well, times were hard. You know, we got paid overtime, and when we got back, we got free food. You know, it was as simple as that. It wasn't a straightforward, you know, there was no moral aspect to it. It was all about individual circumstances. That's the way it was. In terms of the foreign Jewish components, I think what Barbara says is quite right. The thing I would focus on is the fact that where you have a larger proportion of foreign Jews, they have a healthy disrespect for authority in the first instance. They are more likely to have their own organisations, as is certainly the case in Belgium and to a large extent in France. You look at the organisers of the resistance organisation, the Comité de Défense des Juifs, Rouamelot in Paris, and you look at the leading personnel, and they're all refugees from Russia. You know, some refugees from 1905, let alone 1917. You know, social democrats, social revolutionaries, all sorts. They form a nexus for that sort of resistance activity which builds into the process of warning Jewish communities and being able to access them and communicate with them. And I think that's what's missing in the Netherlands to a large, not exclusively, but nothing of that same instance exists in the other countries, Denmark, Norway, and certainly not in the Netherlands.
Okay, that's really, really helpful. Thanks so much to both of you. Okay, so I'd like to close the session and thank our two speakers and thank you for your questions. And we'll move straight on, you know, in a couple of minutes to our next panel on Southeastern Europe. Okay, thanks very much.